with us the so-called rise in China in the military and economic spheres of influence. And I'm looking forward to a very interesting talk. I'd like to give a big warm welcome to GlenKolomeitz.
Thanks very much for that very generous introduction there. It was almost exactly as I wrote it. And thanks for having us here today. Myself and my little jokers, they're pretty good. They'll sit over there and hopefully go for a while. The title is Strategic Threat or Commercial Opportunity. There's a strong argument that they're not mutually exclusive. That the strategic threat is in fact correlates to the commercial opportunity. So you could say it's strategic threat and commercial opportunity. This is that soft power piece. Everyone's heard the term soft power, where hard power is taking in military force, deploying military force and rolling tanks and armour and whatever. That's hard power. Soft power is more taking hegemony in an area or taking some sort of strategic advantage via these commercial relationships and growing this commercial relationships with other countries. So that soft power piece, I say, makes the strategic threat and the commercial opportunity quite interrelated. A bit of an example there is the Iraqi oil scenario many years ago now, where there was conflict in Iraq at the same time as Iraq was selling oil to some of the people who were in Iraq fighting the regime. So you can see how they use that oil, the soft power from the oil production and sales to sort of get in bed with some of the countries who were subsequently fighting in Iraq, fighting the regime. So interesting sort of dynamic there, interesting example. So what's threat? Threat, this is strategy 101. Threat equals capability plus intent. So capability is the military capability, the ability of a country to project military force. You can see an aircraft carrier there. Aircraft carriers, their sole purpose is to project military force, to project force over great distances, these carrier battle groups. And the intent is then often expressed via a country's their publications, such as our defence white paper, is a way that we tell the world our intent, essentially. And, by the way, a country and its militaries speak publicly about its country's intent, its country's military and strategic and economic intentions. Let's have a look here at Chinese capability a little bit. The Chinese brought a former Soviet, a former Russian aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, and they now intend to use that as the model to develop their own organic aircraft carrier capability. That carrier is now operational, but still in deployed sea trials, really. But it's an operational asset. You couple that with this particular aircraft. It's the Shenyang. They call it the Flying Shark. This is a fourth generation, what they call an air superiority fighter. So it's a fourth generation aircraft. Right now, or for many years now, Australia has been trying to buy a fifth generation aircraft, the Joint Strike Fighter. Yep, the F-35. Anyone not sort of seen? We still don't have that capability. We've got a couple of the aircraft doing trials. We still haven't got that. We can't deploy that capability overseas. That's a fifth generation aircraft. The Chinese, on the other hand, have a very, very capable fourth generation aircraft. Now, we don't have that. We had to replace the old F-111s and then the Hornets with the Super Hornets, theoretically a fourth generation aircraft, as a stopgap measure whilst we were waiting for the Joint Strike Fighter. So in terms of this air superiority, the Chinese do have a capability now which is ahead of or more capable than our current air assets. That's a fact. That's a fact. Now, the question there is China is quite in terms of combat radius, mainland China, quite a long way from northern Australia. So projecting force out of mainland off the coast of China would require a carrier battle group capability. They have one carrier operational and aircraft that they could deploy from that carrier, or the ability to deploy aircraft from a land base. Now, there's a big archipelago to our north, which is I'm not saying this is likely to happen, but I'm just giving you that strategic picture. A big archipelago to our north called Indonesia. And on Indonesia, there are many little hop-off points. One particular example is there's an airbase in South Sulawesi, Ujung Pandang, where the Indonesians have a squadron of Sukhoi fourth-generation Soviet fighters. I think they have something like 40, and of those, 1 or 2 are flying. So not the best asset for the Indonesians. However, a very good hop-off point for anybody else who wanted to have a combat radius to Northern Australia. Combat radius just means the ability to launch, fly over, do its job, and then fly back on fuel. All right? So that's just a bit of a picture as to how these assets could be deployed. As I say, China is looking at developing its own organic carrier capabilities. They've stated that in their white paper, and indeed in some of these public statements by senior PLA, so People's Liberation Army, senior PLA officers, and indeed military academics. Now you see here the focus. This is where it sort of goes back to that lack of any intent to go beyond its borders. The Chinese use terminology like protecting our interests or protect our commerce. That's a very self-defensive posture, I think you would agree. Protecting is very defensive rather than offensive, generally speaking. Having said that, the intent to develop a carrier battle group or a carrier strike group allows, or indeed the only reason to have a carrier strike group is to go on the offensive. It's that projection of force that I spoke about before. A carrier allows you to project force over long distances. Now, the Chinese have said that a permissive environment would allow them to go on the offensive. So they could use that carrier battle group to go into an environment where they weren't likely to face any substantial opposition. That's what a permissive environment means. So they're still being a bit self-defensive whilst not discounting the possibility of projecting force. But, and this is from an author, I read this book obviously prior to preparing the original presentation here. This author believes that the Chinese will, by 2020, have this significant, substantial capability to accomplish this mission beyond its aspirations in the South China Sea and Taiwan, but outside of that little sphere of its own influence. So, there are authors saying their capability is developing to the point of being what we call expeditionary. But of course, capability, to have a threat, you need intent as well, capability and intent. So I'm going back and forward here a lot, because you need both capability and intent to pose this threat. So the slide's a bit over the place there, but US naval intelligence have said, and we take this at face value, of course, that's what they've said, is that the inclusion of these new capabilities, these new platforms, this new equipment, allows the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army Navy, so the PLAN, to operate outside shore-based air defence systems. If they operate outside their shore-based, in other words, their air defence systems onshore, they can project this force beyond those shore-based air defences. And which is I think fairly obvious, but it's good to see it written down somewhere, see it actually expressed somewhere. Now, this just shows some of China's missiles that they've developed, and essentially their radius. So you can see, you probably saw in the news in recent months, North Korea's missile program. You would have seen it, it's been saturating the media. North Korea's missile programs, and they show some of these maps with this radius of these missiles coming halfway down Australia and across the coast of the US. Whether or not that is in fact the North Korean capability, the reality is the Chinese have this capability to project this sort of missile-based force, and the outer rim of those missiles is clearly, not within scope of Australia, but nonetheless, this is what they have at the moment. It really does revolve around mainland China and a lot of its claims to its regional claims. That's where I think the heart of their missile defence capability lays. Air superiority. Now, we spoke about the Joint Strike Fighter before, 2022 question mark. I don't know when we're going to get this aircraft operational. We've been told for many years now across multiple governments that we were going to have it in the next couple of years. Well, we're still waiting. Having said that, the Chinese have both these aircraft. The Shenyang was in operation. Well, it will be in full operation this year. And the Chengdu, it was just another variant. They've been working very hard to build up this capability, as have the US to build up their capability with their F-22 and the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, and as have we trying to acquire the Joint Strike Fighter. So I'm not saying the Chinese are developing all this stuff and no one else is. Everyone's doing it. Everyone's buying up military hardware. It just happens that the Chinese are probably a bit more advanced in terms of operational hardware than we are. Now, this is another analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, which is, I think, it's a pretty solid think tank. I tend to put a lot of stock in what RUSI and what ASPI say. They tend to do pretty good strategic analysis. Have a bit of a read of that. The Chinese had this Chengdu at an air show in 2016, so they were showing it to the world, saying, look what we have and look what we can do. That's that message to the world, that message of capability. But also, this, if we have to, this can be our intent. So it's projecting that message. This aircraft has longer range, more internal fuel capacity, which relates to range, obviously, and larger weapons capability than the aircraft we're in the process of buying. So they already have a solid capability, which has to be of concern when we start planning our next defence capital, our equipment acquisitions in the next few years. We should be planning ahead. As any business person knows, you base your capital acquisitions on your overall strategic plan. If you're out there buying hardware with no strategic guidance, then do you know what you're spending your money on? And this is the point that I've raised on a few occasions to both ends of the political spectrum, that are we mortgaging our kids' futures by investing in very expensive military capital hardware without any proper strategic guidance as to why we're buying that hardware? That's a question we should be asking as the public. Again, another analysis of the Joint Strike Fighter. I don't want to harp on it too much, but this particular author again is saying that it doesn't have the range to be useful in our region. In our region. Now, it's a US aircraft. It may well be useful in the US with their carrier capabilities, etc., in their domain, but it's not particularly useful in our region. That's a concern. That's a concern if we're buying hardware which may not be of much value. Okay, Defence White Paper. China has this doctrine of unrestricted warfare. Unrestricted warfare. They're quite vocal about that. It's warfare by any means. Now, okay, sorry about this. Is where the Apple versus PC fight has wrecked the slides a little bit, but anyway. There was a statement made, you fight your way and I fight my way. In other words, the West, we have a way of fighting war. The Chinese are saying we have our own way. And that really, I'll speak about them, it really does bring in a whole lot of possibilities in terms of the use of non-state actors, so proxies, insurgents, terrorists. We know that there are state-sponsored terrorists operating around the world. So a country uses a terrorist group as a proxy to wage war. This happened throughout the Middle East. The US and its coalition allies were fighting insurgent groups or terrorist groups who were proxies of neighbouring Middle Eastern states. So it's not an unheard of concept. And the Chinese have quite expressly not excluded that from their doctrine of warfighting. So intent in their white paper. Does unrestricted warfare mean expansionist, expeditionary? Does that mean they want to project force away from their own region of direct strategic interest? Or could it merely relate to defence of their territory and territories that they claim? The Taiwan and disputed territories policy, so the China's claims to Taiwan and the island groups in that we'll speak about the 9-line shortly, but their claims to that territory, is that expeditionary or expansionist? Or is that merely China laying a claim to territory it believes it was historically or geographically or temporally liable to claim, eligible to claim, entitled to? Okay. Again, this is another couple. This is an analysis and a public statement. So from the white paper, the Chinese white paper. The analysis is the Chinese are developing the capabilities and the doctrine to pose a direct threat to Australia and its interests. Okay, that's what this particular author has said. That's his analysis. All right. Now, we then flow on to what the Chinese have said in their white paper. PLA, People's Liberation Army, is gradually moving its focus from offshore defence to a combination of offshore defence and open seas protection. So again, using the word protection, very self-defensive, but moving beyond those island chains to the open seas. So as anyone who's read our Australian Defence White Paper or International Affairs White Paper, they're written very ambiguously. And the Chinese are masters of ambiguity. So that little statement there is quite ambiguous, but it can be cause for some, it should prompt greater strategic analysis. Are they expeditionary? Again, this is that big question. Is their intent to be expeditionary? Rand has spoken about Obama's pivot to Asia. Remember the pivot to Asia? Obama's pivot to Asia. He wanted to refocus his efforts on the Asia-Pacific region. China's response to that was its own maritime direction, so its own policies to say, well, if the US wants to pivot to our area, we're going to be more active in our area. Okay, that came out of Rand, which is another pretty good think tank. The bottom line is the pivot didn't work. The pivot was a statement of intent which never really was actioned in any tangible way. Having a small amount of US Marines in Northern Australia and having a few freedom of navigation exercises through the region by ships doesn't really mean the US has pivoted to Asia. And indeed, the Trump administration have said, we're US focused. They really don't want anything to do with the pivot to Asia. So I think that basis for China's increased posturing is no longer particularly relevant. Okay, this is where I talk about this the ambiguity in Beijing's, in China's statements of intent. And we're ambiguous too. We don't publish a document saying exactly what we have and exactly what we want to do with it. We don't show all our cards, and nor does China, nor should China. But we can draw a lot from the stated intent already in their white papers and in their public statements. Okay, China just established its first military base, its first overseas military base in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. It now has a foreign military base. And Xi Jinping, the president, said that's there to help promote peace and stability. I'm also certain it's there to support its resources, its movement of its resources from Africa back to mainland China. It's iron ore, it's copper, it's coal, it's the rest of it. They're also considering bases in Myanmar, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Having said that, the US has 800 bases overseas in more than 70 countries. So we can't criticise China for having a base in Djibouti, which is clearly to help protect its maritime passage of resources, when the US has that many bases around the world, including in Australia. All right, so we can't just be looking at China going, oh, look, China's out there being expansionist by making a base in Africa when the US has had bases everywhere for a very long time. Okay, the Weekend Australia, over the weekend. There's always something about China in the papers. Every day there's something about China. Over the Weekend Australian stated something that President Xi Jinping said just recently, that China's military should neither fear hardship nor death. They should engage in real combat training, and they should develop this powerful force that's ready to fight and capable of winning to meet the party's and the people's intent. That's a statement made by Xi Jinping in the last couple of weeks. All right. Now, so again, it's a public statement of intent by the country's leader. At the same time, the same newspaper, the Weekend Australian, over the weekend just gone, has spoken about Chinese demand to boost exports from Australia. So they're saying how we will gain potential increase in revenue of those figures for those three particular resources in that 17-18 financial year. So we're going to profit enormously from the export, and they're pretty big figures. That's increased revenue above what we already make. They're pretty big figures. So on one hand, the Auss is saying China's talking about war fighting. On the other hand, they're reminding us that China is a big export customer of ours, and they rely on those resources for its own domestic markets. So does that demand for resources reduce the intent component of threat? Is China going to cut off its nose to spite its face, deny itself these resources by posing a threat to Australia? There's a pretty good argument that they wouldn't do that. And in fact, Hugh White, I'm unashamedly from the Hugh White School of Strategic Thought. Anyone here not heard of Hugh White? Hugh was he was a former, I think, Defence Secretary. He was an advisor to government. He's a strategic academic in Canberra. This is his most recent piece, Without America. And in this, Hugh quite openly states that he's clearly concerned about our politicians following the British example in Brexit, which was a populist exit from Europe, and sticking with the US in this region where China is honestly becoming the hegemon, becoming the regional power, if not it already is. So he's concerned that for populist reasons, Australia will say, sorry, China, you're powerful, you're our biggest customer in a lot of areas, you're the regional power. America is really abandoning the region, yet we want to stick with America. Now, that question alone warrants greater analysis by the Australian people. That question alone. And Hugh compares it to Brexit. Now, whether Brexit turns out to be a good thing or a bad thing for the UK, who knows, but it was a populist move, and Hugh states that his concern is that we'll do a similar thing with regards to China. Taiwan. Is Taiwan a flashpoint? Of all of those locations, so the South China Sea, those island groups, and Taiwan, a number of analysts, myself included, believe that Taiwan is the only true flashpoint. I'll speak about that more shortly. Having said that, the Taiwanese investments, as it says there in China, are now that percentage of its outward direct investment. So Taiwan and China have a significant economic osmosis. They're very codependent. Yet, so that's from the Chinese side, yet from the US side, Taiwan is the US's main strategic asset in that part of the world, which is our part of the world. The question begs asking, does China, having a look at that last statement, stand to gain more by buying Taiwan, by that economic relationship, than by attacking it using kinetic military means? China has said that one of its key priorities is getting Taiwan back into the family. Well, they've actually said it's never left the family. Is it a nuclear flashpoint? This is that million-dollar question. Many of you lived through that mutually assured destruction era, the Cold War. I joined the army not long after the Cold War. 86 I joined, so I guess towards the end of the Cold War, but nonetheless. So many of you have lived that reality of possible nuclear mutually assured destruction. Beijing, this is again Hugh White, would be willing to fight a nuclear war over Taiwan, again because Taiwan is one of its key priorities, its stated priorities, the reunification, or they say it was never divided, but the reunification of China. The question there is there anything in this region, our part of the world today, which is so important to the US that it would risk a nuclear war? That's a pretty solid question. Obama said yes it is because of the pivot to Asia, but then did nothing really to pivot to Asia. And Trump, the Trump factor, in making, I'm not particularly proud of this hat, but it was given to me by an American military colleague, Make America Great Again. Trump has said that, look, it's all about mainland America. Yes, he speaks with Xi Jinping, and yes, he says, well, the region's important, but not America comes first. So there's a very sound argument there that even under Obama, but now more relevantly under Trump, that America would not risk waging nuclear war over our region. So have they essentially abandoned Taiwan to the Chinese by their action or by their inaction, perhaps? Let's look at the South China Sea dispute. And I use the word dispute there quite in inverted commas, really, because I think there's more to that than just territorial acquisitions. This is that 9-dash line that the Chinese say gives them their entitlement to these, or grounds their entitlement to this dispute, these disputed territories. Those maps, they're a bit, just have a look at them. It sort of shows the disputed territories. Don't sort of read too much into them. But have a look, it's quite a big expanse. And as we know, they've been disputing with all those countries in that region over these territorial claims. All of those countries are big trading partners with China. They all depend on China for import-export for the whole relationship. And none of them, other than the Philippines taking China to the International Tribunal, none of them have really disputed China's actions in that region. So they've almost gone, hands up, America's not really genuinely going to help us. China is the hegemon, is the power, so we're not going to upset China. That's what they're saying. Is the South China Sea a flashpoint? The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was that convention that the tribunal decided this arbitration on, said that any historical rights China claims to those island groups are extinguished. It said that those rocks and reefs are too small to have their own exclusive economic zone. That's that zone around a nation or a country. That the 9-dash line is nonsense, and that what the Chinese are doing, building these military bases and other things on these reefs and atolls, is environmentally damaging. That's what the court has said. What did China say? Get stuffed. Yeah, good answer. China said, whatever. Really, big deal. So, with strategic analysis, there's two questions we ask. The first one is but. There's always a but. We have a position, and we then have a but to analyse further. The competing hypotheses. And we also have another question we ask: so what? And I'll speak about the so what later on. This is what's known as it's a classic power politics piece called salami slicing, where a state goes in and tests the resolve of another country by slicing off bits of salami, by taking over this bit of territory, by attacking this little place, by doing little bits and pieces to annoy the other country and test their resolve. China has been salami slicing for a long time over that whole region, over the building those military bases on their air and runways, on the atolls and things, to see what the Americans would do. What did the Americans do? Nothing. They said, we're going to pivot to Asia, and then they did nothing about it. We're going to have freedom of navigation exercises. The question, so what? Chinese said, yes, drive your ships through there. It's our territory and we're not happy with you, but so what? The point there is that America looks weak by not responding, and China looks resolved and strong. This is their intent. This is that salami slicing. It makes them look like the power in the region, to all those regional countries, and indeed to the world, and to Washington itself. So the South China Sea, this is sort of a view that I have, and I know that Hugh shares it and a few others share it. It's less to do with sovereignty over this territory, less to do with these old arcane international legal principles, and less to do with the rights to the ocean resources, more to do with testing the resolve of China and the US. And guess what? China's weak. China has the greater resolve in this space. That's a statement that I really don't agree with, but it was put around for a while there that when the Court of Arbitration handed down the ruling on the South China Sea, it was a decision to advance this conflict. Well, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. 1 + 1 = 2. Look, it hasn't resulted in conflict. It's resulted in China's resolve strengthening, and the US resolve weakening, but it hasn't necessarily said that there's definitely going to be a conflict. Okay, the inevitability of conflict. And I'm going to talk about Thucydides in a moment, but the inevitability of conflict. This is was a Chinese general. I think he's left his role. But he made this public statement, in 2007, so quite a while ago now, that war with the US is inevitable. He's talking about the Chinese maintaining the initiative and must be prepared to fight. This is that long game. The Chinese have this long game strategy. It goes back to Mao, fighting the long war, where they go in and they're prepared to fight for years and years and years and years, right? This long game. Whereas, as we've seen, the US is not prepared to do that. We saw in the Middle East. They went into Iraq and Afghanistan thinking they were going to be in there, get the job done and get out. As they got more bogged down, they said, we're going to get out of here. So they weren't ready for the long game. Whereas Maoist strategic practice is that they're prepared for the long game, the long fight. So that's his view. That's his general's view. What did Kissinger say? And again, this is going back even further. He refers to the old European balance of power before the First World War, where the balance of power was shifting and it led to the inevitability of war. So Kissinger really says that applies as much back then, prior to the First World War, as it does to this China-US regional issue now. So they're saying that one increase in strength by one, it will definitely evoke an offsetting manoeuvre by the other. Okay, so a related increase in strength or an attack or something, just some sort of posturing. That's Kissinger's view. Kevin Rudd's view. He's referring to again to that tinderbox in the Balkans. Back the First World War. That tinderbox, that spark, that trigger. Thucydides spoke about this. He was talking about the war between Athens and Sparta, and he says that one interpretation of Thucydides is that where we have a rising power and an existing power, there is an inevitable clash between the two. And he uses the Athens and Sparta as the example. The question is therefore, can the US and China avoid falling into that trap? Because there still is an economic interdependence between the two. So is that going to displace them falling into the trap? That's one interpretation of Thucydides, which many authors have stated. Hugh White doesn't agree with that interpretation, Now, I've read Thucydides. I've got an old antique version, edition, and I've got a modern edition. I've read it cover to cover, as has our Prime Minister, in fact. He's quoted it a few times. I happen to agree with Hugh again. I don't believe that conflict is inevitable because you have a rising power and an existing power. I do believe that the danger is where, in our case, Washington and Beijing don't want war, but underestimate each other's resolve and allow some little crisis trigger to escalate to the point that they face a choice between war or humiliation. War or humiliation. China has said over and over, it refers back to its century of humiliation, where the Western powers went in and removed its imperial state, over a century ago. So it's referring to this century of humiliation. It's saying it doesn't want to be humiliated again. The question is a Trump America likely to accept humiliation, a humiliating loss of regional power? Is Trump, with his finger on the keys of his iPhone, of his Twitter account, is he, noting his Make America Great Again rhetoric, is he likely to accept this humiliating loss of regional hegemony, regional power? Now, who knows? That's a big question, but I suspect by their attitude to the region, not really doing much, that they probably would. But we have a personality play here with an individual leader of a country who has a lot of power. China won't accept further humiliation. The business relationships. China was our largest trading partner. Look at all those figures there. We're pretty important to China and they're pretty important to us. As the Chinese domestic incomes rise, their demand for luxury goods will rise. We can meet that demand. They're talking about this was done back when I did this 2 years ago, a slower rate of growth in the demand for resources. Well, that's now turned around as of the weekend, those figures that the Oz put out. So, you know, the demand is booming again for our resources. So my prediction there that the slower rate of growth, that just didn't happen. It's actually booming again. So China needs us to provide these resources, and we need to export these resources. Investment. Okay, this is this is just a whole lot of data. The reality is that Chinese investment in Australia is big. And that relationship is very strong, economically very strong. You might recall the Rio Tinto deal. China has made plays for certain of our key resources players. Okay, the link between economy and strategy, again, a whole lot of information there, but look at things like education. Education in this country, tertiary education, is a commodity, which we export to China by bringing a lot of Chinese students over here to our universities. That's a very big, there's people from the university sector here, it's a very big sector. I've done a lot of degrees and been to a lot of different universities, and I tell you, the Chinese presence is big. I did a few degrees in intelligence, and there were Chinese students on that, quite a few. So look, they're across the whole spectrum. And that's a commodity that we can export. Again, opening up airline routes, all of these bilateral trade mechanisms make for a strong economic link. Okay, now this is where it sort of goes back the other way, where we talk about that soft power. It's this investment and acquisition that form the basis of China's strategy for development, national security, and quite possibly expansionism. So buying up essentially these countries in Africa, in the Horn of Africa and around these sorts of places, buying up the resources, getting hold of ports, the Port of Darwin. You know, this is 101 stuff. This is strategy 101 stuff. And that's a key pillar to say that the economic links are strong, but this forms part of China's soft power projection. Doesn't need to send their carriers overseas, just needs to buy a port or a resources company or a country, Djibouti. And again, that's just China's maritime resources shipping. It's a big sector. Hence, they've secured Djibouti to help protect that passage. Industrial espionage. China has been very actively involved, and we know that. Out there, getting secrets, taking some of our trade, or not our, but global trade secrets, and taking them home and using them to their own benefit. Having said that, can you name a country which doesn't do it? Israel did it. The Israeli Air Force, for a long time, they were flying aircraft based on plans or an airframe that they knocked off. Right? And they had some of their patrol boats were based on a vessel they knocked off. So Israel was doing it. No doubt the US has done it. It's quite possible. Well, in fact, I think there was allegations that Australia had done it when we were sort of allegedly spying on East Timor during some of the Timor Gap. Do you recall that? You know, is that industrial espionage of some sort? Well, you know, quite possibly. Yeah. Anyway, so look, we know what happens. And this is another author speaking about Chinese intelligence operations, and the big focus of this author was this industrial intelligence. Now, I have a little company on the side, which is a corporate intelligence company, and I'll give you a quick story. My company acted for a pretty big logistics company in Sydney a while back. The chairman of which was really worried that the opposition were getting information on a new business line they were going into. So I went in there and with my team and did a little bit of very basic intelligence analysis, and found that one of his senior line managers was married to a senior line manager in the other company, and they were having bed talk. And how do you stop that? You can't say don't talk to your wife. What you do is you're moving to another section, you know. But so that's pretty fundamental stuff, isn't it? You know, it's not rocket science, but when we built this particular company for that piece of strategic advice, you know, and they paid, they were happy for that advice. So look, it's a pretty significant thing. Industrial espionage is a pretty significant piece, and that China is pretty good at it. Okay, online firm spying right from the Telegraph in 2012. Yep, nice headline. It's probably true. Okay, back to that intelligence officer's so what? So what? Economic independence, interdependence. Is that going to affect the prospect of conflict? Absolutely. The more interdependent we are, the more it tends to mitigate the chance of conflict. Having said that, as I said, the Chinese have used that interdependence as one of their mechanisms to gain this soft power. So they don't need to wage military conflict when they already have the assets and have the resources. Unilateral economic dependence. This is where suddenly do we become more dependent on them? And so are we then at their beck and call, like some of these let me give you an example. When I was in East Timor was more an intelligence operation than a stabilisation operation when I was there, because we were keeping an eye on the Chinese. Chinese were building the presidential palace for Guzman, and we were watching 3 times as many electronics tradesmen going into the building than brickies and plumbers and chippies. You know? Now, they might have a lot of electronics in that building, I don't know. Timorese might be very technologically savvy, but it was a bit sus. The Chinese offered, we were going to give to East Timor some patrol boats. The Chinese said, no, we'll give you 3 times as many. The Timorese said, brilliant. But they gave them river-class boats that were useless in coastal work. So, thanks very much, China, but thanks for nothing. The Timorese said, very proud people, I love Timor, I love the people, but they're very proud. They said, we want a space program. East Timorese, NASA. All right, they wanted the space, and the Chinese said, we'll give you a space program. The Timorese said, thank you very much. Are they going to get a space program? No. Are they going to be Timorese on the moon? No. But China made these promises to get this, our nearest neighbour, in its back, economically dependent on China. Now that's a clever strategy on their part. At the same time as we're annoying East Timor by the Timor Gap issues. You know? Ongoing issues over the resources. Okay, cultural and political ties. We have very strong cultural ties in Australia via the universities, via a lot of these think tanks. In recent months, we've seen a lot of media reporting on the fact that these universities are being told what they can and can't say. And a whole bunch of academics in some universities were dragged through the ringer for saying things that were perceived to be anti-Chinese. And a lot of the students arced up, and China threatened to withdraw that economic resource, you know, the academic commodity. So they have exerted influence on our universities. And they have done that. That's factual. That's evidence based. So that's the negative side, I guess, of some of these cultural and political ties. There are also some very positive aspects to it. We have a very big Chinese diaspora in Australia, and I think we don't use that resource as well as we could. And I think we could be engaging with our Chinese communities a lot more without doing a Sam Dastyari. I'm not going to be political, but without doing anything silly with Chinese, connections. But I think we could be engaging a lot more to counter and these potentially emerging threat scenarios. Look, this is China-Australia live fire face-off in the South China Sea. Would we do very well out of that? How would little Australia fare in that scenario? Not particularly well. That's not a scenario we want to see ever. Xi Jinping, who they called him the chairman of everything. He came into power and then almost took the Chinese Communist Party back to the days of Mao by making himself almost this supreme leader. And it was accepted by the party. And he said it was to help strengthen the party and keep that economic growth alive whilst keeping the party in power. Having said that, link that back to his recent statements about the army's role. This building the army, being prepared to fight the long fight and all this sort of stuff. So, there were some pretty strong indicia falling out of that little piece. Here's some food for thought. Is there likely to be some sort of low-scale global conflict in our region in our lifetimes? I think we have to say possibly. We can't say certainly not, and we can't say inevitably, but I think we have to say possibly. Low-level incursions. Is it possible that that incursions on mainland Australia, or indeed Australia's offshore territories, or indeed our interests in the region, could be subject to low-level incursions? So to Chinese troops or others, you know, getting a foothold in there. State-sponsored terrorists, etc. Look, you can't exclude that because the Chinese military doctrine says that it's unrestricted warfare. You can't exclude that possibility, but it's probably quite unlikely. And the status quo. Now, I sent a journal article, I think, to you guys that I had peer-reviewed a number of years ago now, talking about a concert of Asia, where the US and China could quite easily share power in the region. That's no longer, I don't believe, that article, whilst I stand by the article, and Wollongong Uni is about to publish it as well, but I don't think that's possible now. I think the US has given up hegemony in our region. I think it's gone beyond the stage where the US can say it is the regional power in our area. Political influence peddling. Look, both major parties we know have been subject to the donations from large-scale donations from Chinese donors with links to potential links to the Chinese Communist Party. The fact that a senator resigned as a result of it is a fact, but political influence peddling, I don't think anyone can deny, happens in this country. It happened in New Zealand. It's happened in the US. We've seen the Russian US, the Russian Trump thing happening right now, being investigated right now. So it's a real thing. And as I say, the Chinese diaspora, is that a resource? I think yes. I think absolutely it is that we haven't utilised properly. And the Trump factor. We can never forget the Trump factor in any of this sort of stuff. What is likely to happen as a result of the power in the hands of one leader in that political system? Now, even in Australia, right now, our parliament doesn't debate the deployment of force, the deployment of troops. An executive decision is made and the parliament is then informed, right? Over there, which, you know, gives it quite a lot of power to the executive. But over there, that power is vested in one person. The executive is one person, essentially. And that's an awful lot of power, and I think that's something well, look, everyone is thinking about that. Every newspaper, every television article on point. As a former army officer, I have to always throw a Sun Tzu or a Clausewitz quote into everything. It's you know, gospel. So here's a bit of a Sun Tzu quote. Know the battlefield. How does that relate to us? We speak to our politicians, our parliamentary representatives. They make the policies and then tell us what's going to happen. We should be properly informed as to the battlefield, in inverted commas, as to this terrain, what's happening around us. They should be properly informed in making their decisions, in making their policy. But we, as a voting public, should be aware of what's happening around us and should listen to a diverse array of thought on point. So, inviting me along, thanks very much. That's one line of thought. Getting other people to speak about this sort of stuff. I think it's a very critical thing. And the reason why I like speaking to Probuses and U3As and things is that really that's a bit of a closing piece for my speech. And thank you very much. Do we have time for questions, or have I gone too long? Whether it got to the stage of the nuke button, I don't think that'll happen, because I don't think America will ever justify that for our part of the world. Does that answer your question, sort of? Thank you. Any other? Yes.
Aren't the Chinese leaving themselves open to nationalisation in Australia? In other words, they're buying up all these things, and all of a sudden Australia says all Chinese purchases we are taking over in the national thing. Aren't they leaving themselves open for that?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and to be honest, I think that if Australia was to do that, it would leave us open in a big way to, firstly, challenges at the International Court of Justice in that private international law space. So, you know, companies buying companies, etc. I guess them buying up big, they're saying we have the capability to do that. Australia, you want the money, you're selling to us. I don't think the Chinese ever believed we would do that. Therefore, I don't believe they're leaving themselves open to that. I don't think they would ever, they have any contemplation we would ever try and nationalise these Chinese resources.
they're pouring money into America like it's going out of fashion.
Yeah.
Because they can get a very low rate of interest, but they're buying America.
Yeah, and again, I don't think America would be that foolish to try and well, again, the Trump factor, but to try and nationalise all of these resources. So look, I think the challenges are too big for China to be too concerned about that, is my response, I think.
I think there are a couple of other factors we don't really take notice of. And firstly, the extent of investments now that the Chinese taking over in New Guinea. They've actually assumed control of quite a few of what used to be Australian companies. They're in Fiji, they're in Tonga. I have a New Zealand friend who tells me whether it's resentment or fact, but if a New Zealander wishes to travel to Tonga, which is a New Zealand dependency, they have to have the approval of the Chinese embassy.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? If it's true, if it's fact, it's amazing. Look, you're right. They've been very clever buying up resources all around the world, and a lot of countries have allowed that. There's a line in the sand. I think ports are a very significant strategic asset, both in terms of trade and military support. So I think selling off ports is a big, or leasing off ports is a big issue. Buying up companies. Years ago I was in New Guinea when I was a young soldier. We flew into Bougainville to help extract some expat Australians who are working at Bougainville Copper and Arrow Enterprises, a couple of Australian-based companies in Bougainville. Back then, there was no one ever would have considered that a Chinese company would be buying up in those resource-rich parts of New Guinea. But you're absolutely right; it's happened, and these are things that we have to be looking at. They must form part of our strategic planning. We can't say to New Guinea, stop selling your stuff to the Chinese, at the same time as we're increasing our revenue billionfold, selling the coals and the rest of it and the iron ore. So we can't say, you don't do it, New Guinea, and Timor, you don't let them give you a space program, and you don't let them set foot on your thing, but we're still going to keep selling all this stuff for billions. A bit hypocritical, I think, but it's a good point.
Another poorly reported incident was that the Chinese had military operations in Malaysia.
Good point. That's a very good point, and it's true. Not operations, exercises. They've exercised alongside the Malays. They've exercised alongside the Indonesians, the Filipinos, the Russians quite recently, Australia previously. Have a guess who else does that? Us. Every year we send a whole bunch of ships up there and exercise alongside the Philippines, Indonesia, all the time. That's not really an issue. In fact, I think it's a good thing. I'd like to see us exercising more with the Chinese to see how they do business and to see if we can interoperate with them, perhaps. Let me just add to that too. The Chinese, for a long time, and this could go both ways, the Chinese, people don't usually know this, they commit an enormous amount of resources to to the UN peacekeeping operations, to the UN, the DPKO, Department of Peacekeeping Operations. There are a lot of Chinese troops doing mostly maritime peacekeeping around the world, particularly around the Horn of Africa. Now, one argument is that they're being good global citizens. The other argument is they're protecting their interests in those areas. Guess what? Whenever we send troops overseas, we're being a good global citizen and we're protecting our interests in those locations. So again, it's a bit hypocritical to say, I'm not saying you're criticising them, but if we were to say the Chinese shouldn't be exercising with our regional neighbours, well, they're their regional neighbours too, and I'd like to see our ships, our meagre little fleet, alongside some of these Chinese vessels working together. I think that's critical. And in fact, had we not interoperated with the Americans on exercises over the years before we start getting into conflicts again in the last 20 or so years, we wouldn't be able to work so well with them overseas. It's interoperability piece. So I think it's a good thing. Yeah, that they're working with the Malays and anyone else. Yes, mate.
Yeah, Glenn, just in respect to China buying up resources and even countries and so on, going back 40 or 50 years, I suppose, when Japan was in a similar situation, common response from the West was they couldn't win the world by might, they're going to do it by economic means.
Yep.
they certainly did well economically, but that stated from the West that objective certainly wasn't achieved. Is there a similarity with the Chinese position, or is there a significant difference?
That's a great question. And it's a question that, it was going to be one of my new slides last night when I was updating this, but I elected to keep it a bit shorter. Hugh talks about it. There absolutely is a similarity in that. That's a brilliant question, because it's exactly what happened with Japan. Japan didn't become the regional hegemon by buying up all this stuff. Hugh says, and I default back to Hugh says that China is different in that regard because Japan did it and pretty much came to a grinding halt. The Chinese economy is still on the climb, and there's nothing stopping that. In fact, most of these regional countries are supporting that climb. They're growing at a rate that is about to overtake the US in a whole lot of indicia, a whole lot of indicators. So he distinguishes between China's rise and Japan's rise in that regard, in that exact regard. So yeah, great question.
Glenn, you mentioned the high proportion or the percentage of Chinese students that there are at universities at the moment here in Australia. Do you feel that they would pose any sort of a threat, either intelligence-wise, or would they be just here purely for study purposes? Do you have any opinion about that?
Yeah, there is talk that there have been that some of these students are members of the Chinese Communist Party. I suspect a lot of them want to be members of the Chinese Communist Party anyway, because it's good for their careers back home. And there's also talk that they've come into these universities with a view to, one, getting a Western education, but two, influencing what's being said about China, what's being taught, etc. And I think we saw recently a bit of an uprising, I think it was in the University of Melbourne, where a bunch of Chinese students had a protest because an academic put a thing out saying, in English and in Mandarin, I think, whatever, in Chinese and in English, saying, don't cheat. And the Chinese said, by doing that, you're saying that Chinese are cheats. They had a big uproar, carried on like pork chops about. The academic got sanctioned, and they had to remove. But the reason they did it was because the areas that they were finding the cheating in were high Chinese population areas. So there's definitely an influence there. Whether that it comes into the spying regime, well, there's certainly anecdotal evidence that it does, but I haven't heard anything empirical. But you know, look, people are saying that, including in some pretty significant places.
I can give an innocent aspect of that. Some years ago, Barbara and I lived in Orange, and we hosted Chinese students. There was quite a lot, about 20, 30 at a time. And we have still kept in touch with some of them, and one of them we've corresponded with for over 20 years. She's the English teacher at Tianjin University.
Which is great, by the way. It's a great relationship. Yeah,
but getting back to the point, two of the young fellows were very bright but very innocent, and we got to know them because of hosting them. So I asked young George, which is English now, why did he come to Australia, particularly not America or England or whatever, to study? He said, because I'm going to be a business manager and I want to know how to do business with Australia, the Australian way.
Brilliant.
And some of the other kids, all they wanted to do in their spare time, through us and others, was have a look at Australia, and they went back with a positive attitude. And I think that there is possibility for, you know, subversive type of activities, but I think most of these kids are here to study.
Yep. Look, I think that's a great point. That's a great point. When I did a Master of International Law at Sydney, quite a few years ago now, and in one of my subjects, there was a Palestinian student who had studied at the University of Tel Aviv and an Israeli student who was a soldier, but obviously they're all in the army at some stage, but was studying. And at one stage, they both got really heated about why they were studying in Australia. Both of them were throwing accusations at each other. You know, that whole, you're here not to study, you know this stuff, you're here to spy on the Palestinian students, you're here to spy on the Israeli students, all this sort of nonsense. By the end of that particular subject, that course, they were the best of mates. And we started debating the Palestinian wall issue, and they were like almost one mind. It was amazing. So look, that's a great point. I think that the vast majority are absolutely doing the right thing, and I think it's a good thing. But you know, but it doesn't detract from the fact that there is talk, be it empirical or otherwise, or is anecdotal at the moment, that there is spying in these areas. If not spying, certainly influence peddling in terms of impacting what is on the curricula and what's being said. Stifling debate, perhaps, is a better way of saying it.
You think North Korea will collapse within itself?
Yeah, North Korea. I know that's just crazy, isn't it?
It's close.
I'd love to see. I think we'd all love to see China step up and do a bit more. I think the last public statement by Xi Jinping was that if America attacked North Korea preemptively, China would have a crack at America. But if North Korea preemptively had a crack at America, China would start talking to them a bit more. So, that was a bit disappointing, I think. Look, I don't know. I wish I had the answers about North Korea. That's a crazy hotspot, isn't it?
A country with few resources. I think China has to be financing their experiments.
Yeah, I think China is financing it. Well, it's their biggest internal trading partner, but I think China has a big fear. China's big on its own internal physical security. It's scared of the Uyghur presence in the north. It's scared of division around the place. I think China doesn't want a flow of refugees from North Korea or from either of the Koreas into China, but it also doesn't want an American military presence on its border, so up in North Korea. So it's between a rock and a hard place in that regard. So it doesn't want to be smacking North Korea around at the same time. It doesn't want a conflict there. It doesn't want this refugee flow or this US boots on the ground in the north. So, I'm sure China will be stepping up and preventing that. It doesn't want a conflict either, I have to say.
Where do you think India fits in with all this?
Yeah, that's a great point. India has had almost a parallel rise to China, and economically, its military capability, which is more MySpace than the economic aspects, but its military acquisition, hardware acquisition, has been quite paralleled with China. India brought up a lot of Soviet, fourth generation equipment. So India and China are absolutely strategic. I would say rivals in inverted commas. So there's definitely a strategic piece there between India and China. With the US, China, that loss of hegemony in the region, India's been sitting back very quietly because it sort of doesn't need to be kept taking a side. It can just sit back, as has Russia. And this is interesting. Putin has been posturing himself as this not even a middle power, as a great power again, by sitting on the sidelines, almost saying, we're not supporting either of you, but play nicely together. We're sitting back here, not interfering. Of course they're interfering, but not interfering. But we'll just mediate. We'll be the good guys on the sideline. I think India has a role to play in that space as well. But yeah, that's almost a separate dynamic, isn't it? But very relevant to us. The US can't have boots on the ground everywhere because it weakens its position. That's what we saw in the Middle East. The US couldn't be in Iraq, Afghanistan, all over the place, fighting on all these fronts because it became divided and weak. And that would be the point where if China went, okay, we're going to crack at Taiwan, big slice of salami, what are you going to do, America? That's where America would have to say, either we step up and show a resolve or we walk away right now. That's the slice of salami which I think a conflict could arise. Yeah.
How do we know that China isn't behind North Korea?
Yeah, I don't think we do know. We don't know. There's nothing public out there saying that they are. I don't think, as I said about China's biggest concern is its own territorial integrity. I don't think they would be prompting a conflict involving North Korea when they know that the refugee flow and the Western boots on the ground would be totally adverse to its own security interests. So I think we can say strategically, China's not pushing North Korea to war because China doesn't want conflict there in its own backyard. Whether it's behind other things, well, quite possibly could be funding programs and things. We know that North Korea does get resources from China. Otherwise, it'd be mass starvation if somebody wasn't feeding the country. I'm speaking very broadly here, of course, but yeah. So, but I don't think strategically China would be behind posturing a conflict in that region.
Because I thought North Korea, they're supposed to be a nation is behind the eight ball, like in poverty and everything else. Yet they have wonderfully strategic arms and
Yeah.
and all this sort of thing. So they've got to be getting their money from somewhere.
I think a lot of their equipment is reserve grade, but the fact that they have this growing nuclear capability and the capability to put it on platforms and project it, I think Iran was providing North Korea with stuff too for a while. So, you know, they're getting stuff. But I don't know whether I think in terms of their people being able to survive, China is definitely supporting them in those regards, because most other countries are complying with the vetoes, the embargoes.
Thank you, Glenn. That was very interesting. And would you put your hands together for? And on behalf of the club, it's a pin which is made, or bio which is made by one of our members, and we present it to all our speakers.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time.